They lied to you. Your teachers lied to you. Don't get mad at me for exposing the truth. The Queen of Sheba was not a myth, not a bedtime story or poetic metaphor. She was real. Flesh, blood, and crown. An African ruler whose power rippled across seas and scriptures alike. Before you start crying about it, give me 30 seconds to explain. They made her a legend to hide her empire. An empire so vast it touched both sides of the Red Sea, commanding the trade of gold, ivory, incense, and wisdom itself. The Queen of Sheba wasn't a visitor in history. She was history, and her name, Makeda, once made kings kneel, including Solomon himself. They told you she came from some distant exotic land, as if Africa could not birth greatness. They said her story was allegory, that she was a symbol of temptation, of wealth, of the outsider humbled by Israel's wisdom. But what they never told you is that her throne stood upon the backbone of the African world, the Sabaean kingdom, stretching from the highlands of Ethiopia and Eritrea to the deserts of Yemen. Two shores bound by one people, one culture, one queen. Long before Rome, long before Greece, Makeda's world pulsed with trade routes and temples, cities carved in red rock and gilded with the sun. The lie began with translation. The Hebrew word Saba became Sheba, a name left hanging in mystery. In Arabic, she is Bilqis in Ethiopia, Makeda in the West, a myth. Each language chipped away a piece of her until only fragments remained. But archaeology, scripture, and oral tradition tell a different story, one of a queen who reigned not in fantasy, but from an empire whose fingerprints are still on the bones of civilization. Picture her capital, Merib, the jewel of the desert, crowned with a temple called the Maram Bilqis, the House of Sheba. Its columns rose like the ribs of a lion, aligned with the stars. Incense trees perfumed the air, and caravans from across Africa and Arabia bowed to her gates. In Axum, across the Red Sea, African masons and merchants mirrored that grandeur, palaces carved from stone, thrones cast in bronze, scripts etched in jays, long before Latin letters ever formed a word. This was her world, a world where blackness was not a boundary, but a birthright of civilization. When Solomon's scribes wrote of her journey, they described more than a meeting. It was a collision of two powers, he the king of a rising Israel, she the sovereign of an already ancient empire. She came to test him with riddles, yes, but not out of submission. She came as an equal, as one monarch to another, carrying gifts that spoke of her nation's wealth and intellect, gold from the African earth, frankincense and myrrh from trees her ancestors had cultivated for 1,000 years. It was not a pilgrimage. It was diplomacy, African diplomacy, dressed in incense and intellect. And what did Solomon do? He listened, because the Queen of Sheba was not there to worship. She was there to speak, to negotiate, to measure the worth of a man who claimed to speak for God. In that moment, under the scorching sun of Jerusalem, the ancient world witnessed something few have ever dared to imagine. A black woman, ruler of empires, treated as an equal by the wisest king of the Bible. So why did they turn her into a myth? Why was Makeda stripped of her name, her lineage, her empire? Because the truth of her existence threatens the foundation of the stories we were told. The image of Africa as primitive, dependent, voiceless. It shatters when you remember Makeda. They had to turn her into an allegory, so you wouldn't ask how an African woman once ruled the crossroads of the ancient world. She was not a myth. She was Africa's first global power, a queen whose throne connected the Horn of Africa to the heart of Asia, whose fleets crossed the Red Sea long before European ships dared to. Her name survives in Ethiopian chronicles, in Sabaean inscriptions, in ruins that still hum beneath the sand. Her bloodline, If you believe the Ethiopian Kebra Nagast continued through Menelik IV, her son with Solomon, who carried the Ark of the Covenant back to Africa, whether history or legend, the message remains: the divine and royal bloodline of Israel once flowed through African veins. Makeda's truth is not just historical, it is spiritual. She represents the moment Africa looked into the mirror of the ancient world and saw itself not as subject, but as sovereign. She is the memory they tried to erase, the matriarch of black sovereignty, and the proof that Africa's light burned bright before the rest of the world even struck its first spark. They can call her a myth all they want, but the sands of Merib still whisper her name, and the mountains of Axum still echo her story. And if you listen closely, beneath the noise of centuries of erasure, you can still hear her voice, calm, regal, and defiant, saying, "I was here long before they began to write their history books." For centuries, they taught you that the Queen of Sheba was little more than a visitor in someone else's story, a dark-skinned mystery drifting through the margins of a Hebrew text. They told you she came seeking wisdom, as if she were the student and Solomon the master. But that version wasn't history, it was propaganda, written by men who could not imagine a woman, let alone an African one, commanding the ancient world's wealth and respect. The lie wasn't accidental, it was crafted, polished, and sanctified, a political act dressed in scripture, because to acknowledge the truth of Sheba's power would be to admit that Africa was not a bystander in civilization's dawn, it was the throne room itself. The Bible's authors left clues between the lines. The Book of Kings speaks of a queen who came from the uttermost parts of the earth, bringing caravans of gold and spices, yet historians long pretended not to see what that meant. Uttermost was not the poetic east, it was the southern horizon, where the Red Sea widens toward Africa. They would rather place her in Arabia alone, cutting her from the continent's root. The truth is both. Sheba straddled worlds. Her people, the Sabaeans, traded across the narrow sea between today's Yemen and Ethiopia, moving culture, architecture, and bloodlines. The land of Sheba was not foreign to Africa. It was Africa, its empire beating like a twin heart on both shores. But colonial scholars of the 19th century couldn't accept that. To them, anything sophisticated had to come from outside the continent, so they bent evidence to fit their myth. Temples in Ethiopia must have been inspired by Semitic traders. Sabaean script in Africa, probably imported by outsiders. Gold and incense roots mapped across Nubia. Coincidence? They could dig up stone thrones, inscriptions, and ruins across Tigray and Axum, and still deny that Africans built them. Their lie was not just about Sheba, it was about the blackness of genius itself. And so Sheba became Bilqis, a name softened in Islamic tradition, divorced from her African geography, reshaped into a moral tale of humility before a prophet. Then the West borrowed that same humility narrative, turning her into a literary ornament, the exotic queen dazzled by male wisdom. Even Hollywood would later paint her skin lighter, her heritage vaguer, her empire smaller. Every retelling trimmed away her reality until she was safe enough to worship but too distant to identify with. Yet the evidence was always there, buried under sand and prejudice. In 1951, archaeologists uncovered the Temple of the Moon God in Merib, vast pillars etched with inscriptions bearing the name Seba. Across the Red Sea, Ethiopian legends preserved the same kingdom in living memory. The Kebra Nagast, the royal chronicle of Ethiopia, describes Makeda as a ruler of immense intelligence and divine calling, who journeyed not for validation, but for diplomacy. In her return, she brought with her not submission, but a covenant, an idea of divine kingship that would shape Ethiopia for millennia. The lie was simple: make Sheba a visitor, not a ruler, a pupil, not a teacher, a woman defined by the wisdom she sought, not the wisdom she wielded. But to believe that is to ignore the architecture, the trade networks, the political sophistication of the Horn of Africa during her era. This was no isolated land. It was a global crossroad. The scent of frankincense carried from Somali coasts to Egyptian tombs, gold from the Ethiopian highlands minted into coins that would outlast empires. The Queen of Sheba sat at the center of this network like a sun surrounded by orbiting kingdoms. And yet, ask most scholars of the Bible who she was, and they'll shrug. A legend, they'll say. A poetic device. But that dismissal isn't academic neutrality. It's cultural amnesia. It's what happens when history is written by those who must stay blind to their own debt to Africa. Every erased name, every lost kingdom, every mysterious queen turned into myth. All of it serves one purpose, to make the cradle of humanity look like a child forever waiting for civilization to arrive. But Sheba was not waiting. She was trading. She was building. She was ruling. The incense trails that crossed her empire financed temples and cities before Greece was more than a cluster of warring villages. The ships of Sheba carried goods and gospel, merchants and messengers. Her court spoke languages that tied together Nubia, Arabia, and the Levant. She ruled a confederation of wealth and wisdom so advanced that even Solomon's kingdom, small and new, paled beside it. So why did they lie? Because if you trace Solomon's glory to Sheba's gold, you admit that the light of Israel's wisdom was sparked by an African flame. You admit that divine favor did not flow in one direction, that the covenant between God and kings might have been shared with a black queen long before Europe ever claimed holiness, that they could never allow. The erasure of Sheba is the blueprint for how history treats African greatness. First deny it, then exoticize it, then reduce it to myth. But truth is stubborn. It waits in stone and script, in legend and lineage. And every time we speak Makeda's name, we pull another thread from the tapestry of lies. Because behind that myth stands a woman who once commanded the known world, not in whispers or parables, but in laws, armies, and the wealth of nations. Her story is the beginning of a pattern, the deliberate suppression of Africa's golden age to protect the illusion of Western Genesis. And if we are brave enough to keep following her trail, through the sands of Yemen and the mountains of Ethiopia, we'll find something even more powerful than her crown, the memory of a continent that once ruled itself. The truth begins to rise from the dust, not as rumor or reverence, but as stone. The Queen of Sheba's name may have been blurred by empire and translation, but her world still stands, carved into pillars, etched into tablets, and scattered across the ancient trade routes that fed her empire. When archaeologists first began to dig beneath the sands of Yemen and Ethiopia, they weren't looking for her. They were looking for the origins of civilization, expecting to find it in the footprints of Greece or Babylon. What they unearthed instead was Africa, the same Africa that had been written out of the story. In Merib, the old capital of the Sabaean kingdom, the desert hides a cathedral of stone. Its columns still rise against the wind. 6 pillars of alabaster, each scarred but unbroken, once forming the entrance to a temple dedicated to Almaka, the moon god. The locals still call it the Maram Bilqis, the sanctuary of the Queen of Sheba. In its carvings are the curves of vines, the faces of lions, the language of an empire. Sabaic script, elegant and angular, traces the same alphabetic roots that later formed Ge'ez, the ancient Ethiopian tongue that still chants through monasteries today. This was not coincidence. It was a signature, the shared breath of an African-Arabian civilization. Across the Red Sea, in the Ethiopian highlands of Tigray and Axum, those same inscriptions appear again. The stones speak the same words, the same names, the same gods. They tell us that the kingdom of Dumt, one of Africa's earliest states, flourished in the very centuries when Saba was at its peak. They traded across the sea as equals, not colonies. They built palaces from granite, thrones from obsidian, obelisks that still rise against the sky. The air of Axum still hums with the weight of it, a city that would later become the capital of Ethiopia's Solomonic dynasty, claiming descent from Makeda and Solomon's son. But the proof runs deeper than architecture. It runs in the soil, in the bones of trade. The Queen of Sheba's empire sat upon the incense route, one of the world's first global highways. From the green valleys of Ethiopia and Somalia came frankincense and myrrh, burned in the temples of Egypt and Babylon, sold in the markets of Greece and Rome. Every caravan that crossed the desert carried her signature. Every temple that burned her incense bowed in silence to her land. And yet the maps drawn by European scholars for centuries left her world blank. Unexplored, they wrote. Unknown. As if the ruins didn't exist. As if the people who lived among them could not possibly be the descendants of greatness. But the ruins remember. They whisper names like Yeha, the ancient Ethiopian city where a massive temple still stands, walls built from perfectly cut stones, so precise that even a blade of grass cannot slip between them. Its design is Sabaean, its soul entirely African. Linguists found another thread. The Gaze language, still used in Ethiopian liturgy today, mirrors the ancient Sabaean tongue almost letter for letter. Their alphabets dance together like reflections across the Red Sea. Words for kingship, for divinity, for earth and sky, shared. This isn't the language of colonies, it's the echo of kinship. It tells us that Sheba's empire was a twin realm, a single civilization straddling two continents. Makeda's people did not belong to Arabia or to Africa. They were the bridge between them. And in the myths of those who still remember her, Makeda's journey to Jerusalem is not one of worship, but of diplomacy, the first documented foreign exchange between an African empire and a Middle Eastern kingdom. The gifts she brought, gold, ivory, gemstones, were not tribute, they were declarations of equality. And when she returned home, her ships carried more than treasures. They carried ideas, governance, law, and perhaps even the seeds of the Solomonic faith that would later define Ethiopia's destiny. This is what the archaeologists and linguists can't ignore. The timelines align. Around the 10th century BCE, the Sabaean civilization was at its zenith, and so was the kingdom of Dumt. Trade routes connected the two like arteries, pulsing with goods and stories. The legend of Sheba's voyage emerges precisely in this age of exchange. She was not fantasy. She was the human face of that world. The queen who could unite two continents with her will. But revelation alone isn't enough. Knowledge without acknowledgement changes nothing. For every temple unearthed, there are a dozen scholars still unwilling to call it African. For every inscription translated, there's a textbook still repeating that Sheba's story is uncertain. The truth stands in plain sight, but old power fears its implications. Because if Sheba was real, if her kingdom was African and ancient and powerful, then the hierarchy of history begins to crumble. The discovery of Makeda's world forces us to ask the question no empire once asked. What if Africa was not the shadow of civilization, but its dawn? What if the line between myth and memory was drawn by those who needed to own the story? When the wind moves through the pillars of Merib, when it hums through the stones of Yeha and Axum, it carries one answer, soft but undeniable: we were here first. And if the archaeologists have only just begun to uncover her empire, imagine what still lies beneath, untouched, waiting, patient as a queen who knows time is on her side. Before the name Sheba shimmered through the pages of scripture, before Solomon ever heard her footsteps on Jerusalem's stone, Makeda's world was already ancient, already throned in gold and incense. The Sabaean kingdom was not born from myth. It rose from the meeting of rivers, mountains and stars that shaped the Horn of Africa and southern Arabia into one breath of civilization. The Red Sea was not a wall, it was a mirror, a liquid road that joined two worlds. On one shore stood Merib, carved from desert and light. On the other, Axum, rooted in the green highlands that kissed the sky. Together they formed the twin heart of Sheba's empire, a realm that pulsed with trade, ritual, and divine purpose. Imagine it, dawn in Merib. The desert glows copper beneath the rising sun. Camels move like shadows across the dunes, their loads heavy with gold dust and sacks of resin that smell of heaven. The city stirs, its markets already loud, its priests lighting lamps before the temple of the moon god. Makeda's banners flutter over the gates, stitched with symbols of the crescent and star, not of worship to foreign gods, but of alignment with the cosmos. To rule in Sheba was to live in rhythm with the heavens, to read the stars as scripture, to measure time by the movement of light. Across the sea, in the highlands of Dumt and early Axum, men and women cut stone into temples that matched those of Merib in design and devotion. These were not subjects, they were partners, the African branch of a single civilization that spanned both sides of the sea. They built dams to harvest the rains, terraces to grow grain, ports where ships of cedar and acacia exchanged spices, gold and stories. It was here that Makeda's ancestors had learned the craft of empire, how to turn geography into power. Her people were masters of trade and navigation. They controlled the incense routes that linked Africa to the ancient Near East, a chain of caravans stretching from the Somali coast through Arabia, Egypt, and Mesopotamia. Frankincense and myrrh were not luxuries then, they were sacred. The smoke from Sheba's trees rose in the temples of the world's greatest cities, in Thebes, Babylon, and Jerusalem. The wealth it generated was staggering. Every breath of sweet smoke that curled toward the heavens carried a whisper of Makeda's dominion. Politically, Sheba was a kingdom of balance, matrilineal and monarchic, guided by councils of nobles and priests, but ruled by the divine authority of the queen. The Sabaean inscriptions call their monarch Makeda, the one who draws near to the gods. That title would one day shape the Ethiopian word, Negus Nagest, King of Kings. But before the men claimed it, it belonged to her. Makeda was not a mere regent. She was the living bridge between heaven and earth, the voice through whom law and prophecy spoke. Her reign was marked by architecture that defied both time and geography. The Great Dam of Merib, an engineering marvel, harnessed the floods that once destroyed lesser cities. It turned desert into garden, a feat of hydraulic wisdom unmatched until the Roman aqueducts centuries later. Her builders understood water, stone, and mathematics. They understood sustainability long before the word existed. When that dam later broke, centuries after her, legend said it was because the gods mourned her absence. Culturally, Sheba was a mosaic, African, Arabian, Semitic, Cushitic, united by trade and by belief in divine harmony. It was a world of philosophers and astronomers, metalworkers and poets. The priests of Almaka observed the cycles of the moon and the movement of Venus, measuring the rhythm of time, not by conquest, but by creation. In that rhythm, Makeda ruled, her court a sanctuary of art, learning, and diplomacy. Foreign envoys arrived, bearing gifts, hoping to learn the secrets of her prosperity. And from the north, word reached her of a new kingdom rising under a man called Solomon, wise, they said, chosen by his God, builder of a temple of gold. Perhaps curiosity stirred her, perhaps strategy. Either way, Makeda saw opportunity. If she could stand before this king and meet his wisdom with her own, she would secure her legacy as a ruler not of borders, but of knowledge. She would show the world that Africa did not kneel to wisdom, it was wisdom. So she gathered her caravans, 1,000 camels heavy with gold, gems, and incense, and crossed the Red Sea, not as a wanderer or supplicant, but as a queen bearing the weight of a continent. The desert bowed before her, the nations whispered her name, and as her procession reached the edge of Solomon's city, the dust of her passage turned the air golden. This was not a love story. This was an encounter between two civilizations, one old, one young, one written in stone, one just finding its script. And when she stepped into Solomon's court, history bent. Two worlds, two powers, two visions of divine order, meeting not in war but in wonder. What happened next would echo through prophecy, lineage, and myth, and through the centuries of lies that tried to erase her. Because when the Queen of Sheba met Solomon, she did not come to be conquered, she came to test him, and in doing so she revealed a truth the world would spend millennia trying to bury, that wisdom does not flow in one direction, and that Africa was never the pupil, it was always the teacher. The journey to Jerusalem was not a simple pilgrimage. It was a statement written in gold and dust. The Queen of Sheba's caravan shimmered across the desert like a living constellation, each camel draped in woven crimson, each chest filled with the breath of her homeland. Gold from the African rivers, ivory carved from royal hunts, and the sacred incense that made priests in Egypt and Babylon tremble. The air around her was alive with power, with the sound of drums and the chanting of her retinue. This was not myth. This was diplomacy cloaked in majesty, Africa announcing its presence to the known world. When she arrived at Solomon's court, the city stopped breathing. The chroniclers of Israel wrote that she came to prove him with hard questions. But those words, like so many others, were softened to hide the truth. Her riddles were not games. They were negotiations in language, wisdom, and law. Makeda did not seek entertainment. She sought understanding, and Solomon, famed for his intellect, found himself meeting a mind that mirrored his own, disciplined, radiant, deliberate. Imagine that meeting. 2 thrones, 2 crowns, 2 centers of civilization, gazing across a marble hall. The torches flicker. The incense burns. The air hums with prophecy. Solomon asks of her gods, and she speaks of the moon, of balance, of Almaka, and the cycles that govern both harvest and heart. She asks of his temple, and he answers of Yahweh, of covenant and divine favor. They are not adversaries, they are mirrors, each seeing in the other a reflection of their own pursuit of order and wisdom. And then, as the story goes, she tests him, not out of arrogance, but out of curiosity. Her questions, recorded in fragments and echoes, carried the weight of philosophy. What water has no source? What flesh speaks without tongue? What birth brings no child? These riddles were metaphors, veiled debates about creation, the soul and the nature of divine power. Solomon answered, but he also listened. He had never stood before a woman who could weave intellect and majesty so effortlessly, who could move from trade to theology in the same breath. That night, the scribes of Israel wrote of her splendor, her retinue, her wealth. They wrote that there came no more such abundance of spices as these, which the Queen of Sheba gave to King Solomon. But what they omitted was the reverse, that Solomon too gave gifts in kind, gold, garments, vessels, and what the old texts call his heart. Whether love or respect, that exchange marked something deeper, a union of 2 kingdoms, bound not by conquest, but by comprehension. The Ethiopian chronicles tell a richer version. In the Kebra Nagast, Makeda's wisdom surpasses Solomon's pride. When he tries to test her purity and obedience, she turns his game upon him, proving that no man, not even a prophet king, can outwit divine will. In that story, she does not leave humbled, she leaves fulfilled, carrying within her the promise of a lineage. Her son, Menelik Ford, would one day return to Jerusalem, take the Ark of the Covenant, and bring it to Ethiopia, making her bloodline not only royal, but sacred. Whether one believes that tale or not, its symbolism is thunderous. The Ark, symbol of divine favor, dwelling not in the hands of Europe or the Near East, but in Africa. It's here that history and myth intertwine like gold filigree, because if Makeda's son truly carried the Ark to Axum, then the spiritual heart of the Abrahamic faiths pulsed once within Africa. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church still guards the tabot, the supposed ark, within the chapel of the tablet, forbidden to all but its keepers. Pilgrims weep outside its walls, believing that within lies the proof of Sheba's legacy, that the divine covenant passed through her womb, that Africa itself became the house of God. But even stripped of mysticism, her encounter with Solomon reshaped the ancient world. Trade between Sheba and Israel deepened, maritime routes expanded, cultural exchange flourished. The gold that gilded Solomon's temple, some say, came from the mines of Makeda's land. The sacred oils that anointed Hebrew kings, pressed from trees that only grew under the African sun, Their meeting was not the beginning of Africa's story, but its revelation. The moment the world could no longer pretend not to see where its wealth and wisdom truly flowed from. The scriptures turned her into a symbol of seeking, the Queen of the South, who came to hear the wisdom of Solomon. But perhaps the greater wisdom was hers. She saw through the vanity of men who believed their God favored them alone. She understood that divinity was not the property of nations, but the reflection of justice and balance, the same forces her ancestors worshipped beneath the African moon. When she returned home, she carried no shame, no subservience. She carried sovereignty, refined by dialogue, power tempered by perspective. In the eyes of her people, she had conquered without war. She had crossed deserts and kingdoms, stood before prophets, and returned unbroken. When she stepped once more into the golden light of Merib, her people knelt, not out of fear, but reverence. She was no longer just queen. She was legend in motion, the embodiment of Africa's divine intellect, the woman who made the wisest king of the ancient world listen. And from that moment on, the world would try to bury her memory beneath layers of allegory and scripture, because it is dangerous, profoundly dangerous, when a woman of color holds both beauty and wisdom, both crown and command. They would reduce her to myth, so that her descendants would never remember that their grandmother once ruled empires, negotiated with kings, and carried divine legacy in her blood. But we remember, the stones remember, and through that remembrance, the queen rises again, not as Solomon's guest, but as history's rightful sovereign. Behind every throne is a civilization, and behind the Queen of Sheba stood one of the greatest the world has ever forgotten. When we speak her name, we often imagine her alone, regal, radiant, commanding from her palace balcony, as the desert winds coil around her crown. But Makeda was never alone. She was the reflection of a people, engineers, scholars, warriors, poets, farmers, navigators, each carrying the light of a culture that existed long before her and thrived long after. To understand her, we must step into the pulse of her world, the heartbeat of Sheba itself. Her capital, Merib, was a living organism. Its walls breathed with the rhythm of trade and devotion. The great dam, a colossal arc of stone and earth, stretched nearly 2,000 feet across the valley. It gathered the monsoon rains and distributed them through an intricate web of canals that transformed the desert into paradise. This was not primitive ingenuity. It was environmental mastery. Makeda's people knew the science of water, the logic of land. Their irrigation systems sustained orchards of date palms, fields of barley, and groves of frankincense trees that perfumed the horizon. They understood harmony, the delicate balance between earth and sky that modern empires still struggle to achieve. The engineers were not faceless laborers. They were respected artisans, bound by guilds that recorded their methods in symbols carved onto stone. Every block of the dam bore an inscription, a testimony that the builder and the divine were collaborators. To build was to pray. To irrigate the land was to honor the gods. And in that collaboration lay Sheba's strength, the idea that power was not only in kings or queens, but in the collective genius of her people. The scholars of Sheba were no less extraordinary. In the libraries of the palace, papyrus and parchment carried treatises on medicine, astronomy, and law. Their scribes wrote in the Sabaic script, a language of angles and precision, a language that would one day evolve into Jez, the sacred tongue of Ethiopia. They charted the phases of the moon, predicting the flood cycles that guided agriculture. They mapped the stars for navigation, for prophecy, and for poetry. The queen's advisors were not priests of blind faith. They were scientists of the sacred interpreters of the universe. And then there were the traders, the lifeblood of Sheba. They were men and women who crossed deserts and seas, guided by constellations, carrying the wealth of Africa to the empires of the north. They brought gold from the mines of Nubia, ebony from Kush, ostrich feathers from the Sahel, and pearls from the Red Sea. They returned with fine textiles, spices, and stories. In every marketplace, from Egypt to Mesopotamia, the mark of Sheba was known, the symbol of the crescent and the bull, stamped on goods of unmatched quality. These traders were diplomats, storytellers, cultural bridges, ambassadors of a world that refused to be provincial. But Sheba's glory was not built by merchants and scholars alone. It was defended by warriors whose reputation stretched across continents. The Queen's Guard, the children of the Lion, rode camels and chariots, adorned with silver, their spears tipped with obsidian, their shields painted with suns. They were disciplined, trained in the art of maneuver and patience. Foreign armies feared them not for their numbers, but for their precision. The Ethiopian highlands, their ancestral training ground, forged soldiers who could move like wind and strike like thunder. Every battle they fought was an echo of the Queen's authority, swift, deliberate, divine. In Sheba, women did not live in shadow. The society Makeda inherited and ruled valued them as pillars of continuity and wisdom. Women were priestesses, healers, and merchants. The queen herself was the culmination of that reverence, the embodiment of the sacred feminine that balanced the masculine force of war and governance. In temples, goddesses shared altars with gods. In courts, female judges rendered decisions that even generals obeyed. This was a civilization that understood balance, a balance the later world would forget when it reduced women to silence and Africa to servitude. Culturally, Sheba shimmered with diversity. Music filled its streets, drums, lyres, flutes carved from ivory. Dancers moved like flowing sand, mimicking the movement of stars. Artisans and goldsmith workshops shaped jewelry so intricate that Roman craftsmen would later study their techniques. Perfume makers distilled fragrances that became legend. The Sheban aesthetic was opulent, but deliberate. Beauty was not excess. It was evidence of divine order. To live beautifully was to live rightly. The spiritual life of Sheba was equally rich. The temples of Alnaka and the sun god stood as centers of both worship and philosophy. Rituals were public celebrations of gratitude, aligning human rhythm with cosmic law. The priests were astronomers. Their prayers were calculations. The people did not beg the gods, they negotiated with them, offering harmony in exchange for harmony. And in this cosmic contract, the queen served as the mediator, the voice of balance between heaven and earth. When Makeda rose each morning, her court assembled not just to praise her, but to discuss governance, trade, irrigation, and justice. Decisions were made collectively, inscribed on tablets that later generations would unearth and marvel at. Sheba's law system, though lost in detail, survives in fragments: edicts of fairness, contracts of trade, records of land stewardship. It was a civilization of intellect, built on reciprocity, reason, and respect for creation. This was the world that shaped Makeda, a world that raised her not merely as a monarch, but as a reflection of her people's brilliance. Every time she spoke before Solomon, every time her ship sailed the Red Sea, she carried the voice of millions, the memory of architects, traders, and scholars whose names history refused to record. And perhaps that is why her story still burns through the fog of myth. Because Sheba was never just a queen's tale. It was the story of an entire civilization standing on the shoulders of its own genius, unacknowledged yet unforgotten. A people who proved that greatness was not something borrowed from the outside world. It was born in the red earth of Africa, in the hands of those who built, dreamed, and dared before history even began to write their names. They didn't just forget her. They buried her. They buried Makeda beneath centuries of conquest, translation, and theological theft. The suppression of the Queen of Sheba's legacy wasn't an accident of time. It was a design. History didn't misplace her. Empire erased her. When the hands that wrote the New World began their work, they decided that Africa could be the cradle of life, but never the cradle of wisdom. And so they severed Sheba from Africa, turned her from a sovereign into a story, and turned her people into shadows beneath someone else's light. It began quietly, as most erasures do. The first blow was linguistic. The name Makeda vanished from common record, replaced by Bilqis in Arabic texts and Queen of Sheba in the Western canon, an identity so vague it could be reshaped by anyone's imagination. Her kingdom, once a vibrant Afro-Arabian power, was redefined by foreign tongues as South Arabian, as if the Red Sea were a wall instead of a bridge. In that one shift, Africa was cut out of its own narrative. The same scholars who traced Greek gods and Persian kings with meticulous care dismissed her as allegory, a fable about female vanity and male wisdom. Then came the theologian. In their sermons, Sheba became a symbol of the Gentiles, the outsider who came to marvel at divine truth, a pagan humbled before a chosen man. The queen who once made kings listen was now recast as the one who listened herself. They twisted her brilliance into a moral lesson. Even she recognized the greatness of Solomon. Even she, meaning the black woman, the foreigner, the one whose only virtue was knowing when to kneel. It was theology as propaganda, sanctifying racial hierarchy centuries before the term existed. When Islam expanded, Sheba survived in the Quran as Bilqis, wise, yes, but still a tool of someone else's revelation. The prophet Solomon's story absorbed hers. She was praised for accepting the one God, but her own gods, her own spiritual science, her own civilization, were erased in that act of conversion. The message was clear. The greatness of Sheba was valid only when measured against the light of someone else's truth. And when Europe came, with its ships, its Bibles, its greed, they finished the burial. Colonial archaeologists in the 19th and 20th centuries stood on the ruins of Yeha, Axum, and Merib, and wrote papers declaring that such structures must have been Semitic imports. They could not imagine that Africans had carved these stones, aligned these stars, written these scripts. To them, everything magnificent in Africa had to come from elsewhere, from Phoenicia, from Arabia, from Europe itself. Even as local Ethiopian priests told them stories of Makeda and Menelik, even as they found inscriptions in Sabaic and Jez, side by side, they dismissed them as coincidence. The evidence was shouting, but their prejudice was louder. The suppression wasn't just scholarly, it was systemic. Colonial education taught generations of Africans that their ancestors lived in tribal darkness until the missionaries arrived with light. The name Sheba was mentioned, if at all, as a curiosity of scripture, never as the foundation of empire. Children grew up hearing of Cleopatra, of Helen of Troy, of Elizabeth I, but not of Makeda, who reigned before them all. To deny her was to deny the possibility of black sovereignty itself. The tragedy deepened when modern theology began to sanitize the Bible for colonial consumption. Paintings of Sheba in European cathedrals lightened her skin, narrowed her features. She was painted as Mediterranean, even Nordic. In some depictions, she was veiled, faceless, her blackness erased under gold leaf. Every stroke of paint was an act of rewriting, a visual lie told in oil and halo. Because they knew the danger of a black queen seated beside the wisest man of Scripture, they knew what it would mean for colonized peoples to see themselves in her. But truth has a pulse that cannot die. In Ethiopia, they kept her memory alive, not in libraries, but in living tongues. The Kebra Nagast was more than myth, it was resistance literature. It said to the world, our lineage is divine, our crown is ancient. Even when foreign powers tried to strip Ethiopia of its identity, that text whispered back that the Ark of the Covenant, the symbol of God's promise, rested not in Jerusalem, not in Rome, but in Axum. In doing so, it preserved Africa's right to spiritual legitimacy. Meanwhile, in Arabia, ruins of the Sabaean civilization refused to stay silent. The Maram Bilqis still stands, its columns reaching toward the sky like the fingers of a hand, refusing to sink into the sand. And across the sea, in the Ethiopian highlands, the obelisks of Axum pierce the clouds, defying time and denial alike. These are not coincidences. They are monuments of memory, shouting to anyone who will listen that the Queen of Sheba was never a ghost. She was a foundation. Why was she buried? because Makeda represented everything the architects of empire feared. A woman in command of herself, a black civilization self-sustaining, a continent that needed no rescue. To keep their illusion of superiority intact, they had to sever Africa from its queens, its scholars, its builders. The erasure of Sheba was psychological warfare. Make a people forget their throne, and they will forget their worth. But what they buried, they also preserved, unintentionally. For every lie carved into textbooks, there remained a song, a ruin, a whisper, and those whispers are growing louder now, in the voices of scholars, artists, and dreamers reclaiming the truth. The soil of Axum still holds her footprint. The incense trees of Somalia still exhale her memory. The blood of her descendants still carries her defiance. They thought erasure was victory, but the Queen of Sheba lives in every African child who looks at history and dares to ask, what did they hide from me? They say she left Jerusalem with gifts and wisdom, but what she carried home was far more powerful, a covenant. When Makeda returned to Sheba, her ships heavy with treasures and stories, she was not the same queen who had departed. The journey to Solomon was not a pilgrimage of submission, it was an exchange of equals. And from that meeting came not a myth, but a bloodline, one that would alter the course of African history for millennia. The Kebra Nagast, the Ethiopian Book of Kings, tells us what Western theology tried to forget, that the Queen of Sheba bore a son by Solomon. His name was Menelik, son of the wise. When he came of age, he traveled to Jerusalem to meet his father. Solomon, seeing his reflection in the young man, crowned him with honor and sent him back to Ethiopia, not empty-handed, but carrying something sacred, the Ark of the Covenant itself. Whether you take this as literal or symbolic, doesn't matter. What matters is what it meant. The Ark was the embodiment of divine authority, and according to Ethiopian tradition, that authority had now passed into African hands. This was not a stolen relic, it was a transference of destiny. In this story, Africa did not borrow holiness, it inherited it. The Ark, said to rest even now in Axum's Church of St. Mary of Zion, became the heart of Ethiopian spirituality and sovereignty. It made Ethiopia not just a kingdom, but a sacred trust, a place where divine presence was said to dwell. The people of Axum called themselves not subjects of a queen, but guardians of a covenant, and that belief carried Ethiopia through centuries of isolation, invasion, and faith. But beneath the myth, there is evidence. Archaeologists have traced the rise of the Aksumite Empire to the centuries following Sheba's reign, a civilization that commanded the Red Sea trade, minted coins in its own image, and declared its kings, sons of Solomon, and the Queen of the South. Their inscriptions were written in Jais, the script descended from Sheba's own symbolic tongue. Their architecture blended African grandeur with Arabian precision, showing a continuous cultural bridge, not a foreign transplant. When Rome traded with Axum, it did so as an equal power. Coins bearing the image of King Azana, Makeda's distant descendant, were found as far away as India. This was no legend, this was legacy. Even the spiritual philosophy of Axum echoed Makeda's world. The temples once devoted to Almaka became churches devoted to Christ, but the old respect for balance, for cosmic harmony, remained. Ethiopian Christianity was not an imported faith, it was an evolution of an older African theology, one that recognized the divine feminine, revered the elements, and wove science into spirituality. The priesthood of Axum preserved rituals that predated the Bible, processions of light, chants in ancient tongues, music tuned to celestial cycles. The queen's memory lived in every ritual, every crown, every hymn. And while Europe would later claim that the Renaissance was the rebirth of human intellect, Ethiopia had already been nurturing its own golden age. The monasteries of Lalibela carved entire cathedrals out of solid rock, not built from the earth, but sculpted within it, like holy mountains, hollowed by faith. The walls were adorned, not with pale saints, but with dark-skinned angels and queens wearing gold crowns. In these sacred spaces, Makeda's story was not just remembered, it was sung. Her image appeared beside Solomon's, not as subordinate, but as counterpart. For the people of Ethiopia, the Queen of Sheba was not ancient history. She was the mother of their kings, the origin of their right to rule. Even the great Emperor Haile Selassie traced his lineage to her. His title, conquering Lion of the tribe of Judah, was not an imitation of Israel, but a reclaiming of that covenant. To call oneself the descendant of Sheba and Solomon was to declare that African royalty was divine, not derived. The Ethiopian crown was not granted by Rome or by London. It was inherited from a queen who stood before one of the most powerful men in Scripture and found herself his equal. And that, more than any artifact or inscription, is the truth that frightened empire. Because if Sheba's line was real, if Africa's kings were heirs to divine promise, then the very foundation of colonial theology collapsed. How could the colonizer justify dominance over the descendants of God's chosen bloodline? How could they preach inferiority to the people who once carried the ark itself? They couldn't, so they buried it. They called it legend, folklore, fantasy. But the story refused to die because it wasn't merely written in books, it was engraved in identity. Even today, pilgrims gather in Axum, waiting for a glimpse of the ark that no outsider may see. Monks guard it with their lives, believing that to behold it is to witness God's own presence. Whether the ark rests there or not, the devotion is proof of something deeper, that Africa's faith in its own sacred origin has never been broken. The Queen of Sheba's name may have been twisted, her image diluted, her story scattered across scriptures and scrolls, but her legacy endures in the living faith of her descendants. She was more than a visitor to Solomon's court. She was the bridge between worlds, between Africa and Asia, between woman and man, between myth and memory. Through her son, she gave Africa not just a crown, but a covenant. And through her story, she continues to remind the world that Africa has always been a source of power, not its echo. Her story did not end with her death. It multiplied. The spirit of Makeda rippled through the centuries, shaping empires, prophecies, the very idea of divine authority itself. Long after her body returned to the dust, her bloodline walked in crowns and carved kingdoms from the red soil of Africa. Through Menelik I, she became not just a memory, but a lineage, the living bridge between the sacred and the sovereign. Ethiopia became her altar, and every ruler that followed was a verse in her ongoing scripture. From Axum's golden age to the rise of the Solomonic dynasty in the 13th century, the claim of descent from the Queen of Sheba was not political theater. It was spiritual currency. It sanctified governance. It meant that rule was not granted by men, but by covenant. When Yakuno Amlak restored the Solomonic line in 1270, he did so under the banner of Makeda's legacy, declaring himself heir to both Solomon's wisdom and Sheba's sovereignty. And the people believed, not because of superstition, but because that belief preserved something the world was trying to erase, the idea that Africa's kingship was ancient, divine, and unbroken. For nearly 7 centuries, Ethiopia's emperors would rule under her name. Their coronation rituals echoed the journey of Makeda, crossing deserts, fasting in solitude, receiving anointment with sacred oil said to trace back to her time. In their courts, priests recited the Kebra Nagast as history, not legend. Each emperor saw himself as a continuation of the queen's vow to preserve wisdom, justice, and faith. The throne itself was called the Takla Nagast, the plant of kings said to have sprouted from the roots she planted. When the world fractured under colonial conquest, it was Ethiopia, Makeda's Ethiopia, that stood as the continent's defiant reminder of sovereignty. While the scramble for Africa divided the land, Ethiopia remained independent, guided by an unbroken spiritual lineage. The Italian army that marched on Addis Ababa in 1896, thought it was confronting a weak empire. Instead, it faced the descendants of Sheba, the same blood that had built cities and deserts and dammed rivers in drought. At Addwa, Ethiopian generals, many descended from noble lines tracing back to the queen, crushed the invaders. That victory wasn't just military, it was ancestral. It was Makeda rising through her children, reminding the world that Africa could still command its destiny. Then came Haile Selassie, Might of the Trinity, conquering Lion of the tribe of Judah. He stood before the League of Nations and declared, "God and history will remember your judgment." Behind his composure was the memory of his matriarch, the queen who once stood before Solomon and spoke truth to power. Selassie's rule was not just modern governance, it was a continuation of sacred duty. He saw himself as the keeper of Makeda's flame, the guardian of her covenant. And though the world often misunderstood his theology, his existence alone was living proof that Africa's sacred monarchy had endured from antiquity into the modern age. Across the seas, in the Caribbean and the Americas, her name found new meaning. Through the Rastafari movement, born among the descendants of enslaved Africans, the Solomonic line became a symbol of redemption. They saw in Haile Selassie not just a king, but the embodiment of divine justice, the return of the covenant to its rightful heirs. When they called Ethiopia Zion, they were not misplacing a biblical dream. They were restoring an ancient truth. Makeda's bloodline had become the thread reconnecting a scattered people to their origin. For those in exile, she became the lost mother, the proof that royalty was their inheritance, not their fantasy. But her legacy reached even beyond faith. In the arts, in scholarship, in resistance, the spirit of Sheba reappeared wherever African dignity sought its voice. In the Harlem Renaissance, poets invoked her as a muse, the emblem of black majesty in a world of oppression. In Pan-African movements, her image adorned banners and speeches, standing beside figures like Nzinga, Nefertiti, and Cleopatra. But Makeda's story was different. She was not a figure of rebellion or beauty alone. She was the architect of empire, the matriarch of divinity. She represented not the dream of freedom, but the memory of having already been free. Even now, her descendants, genetic, cultural, and spiritual, continue her work. Every woman who builds, teaches, leads, and creates against a world that doubts her is part of Makeda's resurrection. Every historian who dares to place Africa at the center of civilization reopens her tomb and releases the truth that was buried there. Sheba was never just about the past. She was prophecy, a vision of what happens when African knowledge, African faith, and African power exist in harmony. And as the modern world rediscovers its fractured history, the Queen of Sheba stands as a mirror. She asks every generation the same question: what do you call wisdom, and who do you believe is worthy to hold it? Her story challenges the arrogance of empire, the blindness of academia, the violence of erasure. It reminds us that civilization does not need to be borrowed, that sanctity does not need to be validated by foreign approval. The Queen of Sheba's legacy is not just Ethiopia's inheritance, it is Africa's memory of itself, the proof that long before the world divided races and religions, there was a time when Africa stood as the axis of wisdom, faith, and power. Her story is a reminder that black greatness did not begin with liberation movements. It began with creation itself. Makeda's throne may have turned to dust, her palaces buried beneath sand and stone, but her idea endures that a queen could rule with intellect, with spirit, and with sovereignty, that Africa was and remains divine. History has a strange way of circling back to its beginnings. The sands of time, no matter how deep, cannot forever conceal the footprints of a queen. Today, archaeologists, historians, and storytellers are beginning to hear the whispers that empire tried to silence. The voice of Makeda, echoing through the ruins of Merib Yeha and Axum. Her name, once dismissed as legend, is returning to its rightful place, not in the margins of myth, but in the heart of human civilization. The world is remembering what Africa never forgot. Excavations across Ethiopia and Yemen have begun to reveal the outlines of her world. The Great Dam of Merib, one of humanity's earliest feats of hydraulic engineering, still stands, its remnants a testament to the Sheban mastery of water in a desert where empires later perished. Tablets inscribed in Sabbatic and Ge'ez confirm what oral tradition preserved, that Sheba was not merely a trade outpost, but a seat of innovation, diplomacy, and divine kingship. In the stones of Yeha, archaeologists found the echoes of temples older than Solomon's Jerusalem, aligned perfectly with the stars, proof that Makeda's ancestors charted the heavens long before their names were erased from the stars' reflection in history books. In museums around the world, artifacts once labeled South Arabian are now being reclassified with a fuller understanding of Africa's contribution. The DNA of civilizations, once traced narrowly through European and Middle Eastern frameworks, is being rewritten to include the genetic and cultural imprint of the Horn of Africa. The borders that colonial historians drew across deserts and seas are dissolving, replaced by maps of migration, trade, and kinship. What emerges is not an isolated Sheba, but a network, an African-centered world system that connected Nubia, Punt, and Arabia into a shared civilization of knowledge. But archaeology alone cannot restore what was lost. Truth needs more than evidence. It needs memory. Across the African diaspora, artists and filmmakers are resurrecting Makeda as both historical figure and spiritual symbol. In novels, she walks again through palaces of gold and incense. In paintings, her dark skin glows against the flame of candles, no longer myth, but majesty. She appears in music, in dance, in fashion, a reclamation of what was stolen, a rewriting of the image of power itself. To say Queen of Sheba today is to invoke not submission, but sovereignty. And it is not just artists. Scholars of theology are revisiting the biblical texts themselves, reading them with African eyes, uncovering layers that Western exegesis ignored. They point out that the Bible never says Sheba was not African, that Solomon himself described her beauty in metaphors of darkness and gold, that the Song of Songs, I am black and beautiful, could easily have been written for her, or by her. Faith, too, is beginning to decolonize, to accept that holiness is not bound to geography or skin tone, but to truth. In Ethiopia, the living memory of Makeda remains unbroken. Every year, processions in Axum celebrate the Ark of the Covenant. Monks chant hymns that trace their origins back to Sheba's temples. Pilgrims walk barefoot to the ancient churches of Lalibia, whispering her name like a prayer. For them, she is not myth, she is mother. When Ethiopian women speak of their strength, their patience, their grace, they speak of Makeda's inheritance. She is the archetype of the African feminine, wisdom married to sovereignty, beauty fused with intellect, gentleness bound to command. Beyond Africa, her image continues to evolve. In Jamaica and Trinidad, Sheba has become a name of reverence, invoked by poets and Rastafari prophets alike as the embodiment of black divinity. In African American communities, she stands as the answer to centuries of cultural theft, a reminder that the first queens did not sit on European thrones, but on African soil. Every time a black child learns her name, a chain in the cycle of erasure breaks. Every time an artist paints her with the features that history tried to smooth away, the world tilts a little closer to truth. Because the Queen of Sheba is not just an ancient memory, she is a living metaphor. She represents the truth that knowledge and power are not given, they are reclaimed. That history is not what is written by victors, but what is remembered by survivors. Her story is the story of Africa itself, brilliance, buried, rediscovered, reborn, and maybe that is her final gift to us. She teaches us that power does not need validation, that truth does not need permission to rise. Her legacy reminds us that even if the world forgets your name, it cannot erase your impact. Makeda's civilization may have fallen, her temples may have turned to dust, but the ideals she embodied, sovereignty, intellect, and faith, are eternal. Today, as the descendants of the diaspora reconnect their roots, as Africa reclaims its narrative from the ruins of colonial distortion, the Queen of Sheba rises once again, not from scripture, but from consciousness. She stands not as Solomon's guest, but as Africa's mother of empires. The myth has become mirror. The forgotten queen has become prophecy fulfilled. And as her voice returns through every historian, artist, and dreamer who dares to tell her story, her message rings clear across time. They tried to bury me beneath their lies, but I am the soil, and from the soil I rise. To understand Makeda fully, one must move beyond the walls of palace and empire, beyond even the reach of history itself, because Sheba's legacy was never just political, it was spiritual. Her story is the echo of something much older, something that runs like an underground river beneath all African traditions: the worship of balance, the reverence for the divine feminine, the understanding that creation itself is a dialogue between forces, never domination, but harmony. Makeda was the manifestation of that truth, in flesh and crown. She was not only a ruler, she was a priestess of equilibrium, a bridge between heaven and earth. Long before the Abrahamic faiths, Africa understood that the feminine was sacred, not secondary. In the temples of Kemet, Maat, the goddess of truth and cosmic order, ruled not through power, but through balance. In Yoruba cosmology, Oshun carried sweetness, fertility, and wisdom, the energy that made kings legitimate. Among the Kushites, goddesses like Amanirenas and Kandake personified sovereignty as a divine right of womanhood. Makeda emerged from this lineage. She was the continuation of that spiritual matriarchy, not its exception. Her reign embodied the principle that power without compassion is tyranny, and wisdom without empathy is sterile. In her court, the scholars and engineers served not just the state, but the soul of the people. Each law, each edict, each festival was rooted in reciprocity, the knowledge that prosperity was not achieved by exploitation, but by alignment with the divine order. The Shebans did not pray for conquest, they prayed for balance. They offered incense, not to beg, but to affirm their participation in creation's rhythm. When she journeyed to Solomon, she carried this spiritual science with her, the ancient African understanding of duality, of masculine and feminine as complement, not competition. Their encounter was not just a meeting of monarchs, but a union of cosmic principles. Solomon's wisdom was reason, Makeda's wisdom was intuition. He spoke of law, she spoke of balance. In the harmony between them, truth was born. But when patriarchal civilizations later retold the story, they could not conceive of such equality. They reduced her to the listener, the test-taker, the foreign admirer. They missed the deeper revelation that she was not there to learn, but to remind him of what he had forgotten, that wisdom without humility becomes arrogance, and power without love becomes decay. In African spiritual philosophy, the feminine principle is not confined to gender. It is a cosmic energy, the womb of possibility. It governs creativity, healing, and renewal. Makeda's Sheba embodied this principle in its architecture, its irrigation, its trade, all acts of creation and sustenance. Her civilization was a living ritual, where the queen herself was the vessel through which divine harmony flowed into governance. This is why her reign endured in memory. It was not merely administration, it was ceremony. The suppression of her legacy was in part the suppression of that sacred feminine. When foreign powers replaced queens with kings, and balance with hierarchy, the world shifted into spiritual imbalance. Patriarchy and empire walked hand in hand, rewriting creation as conquest. The temples that once honored both gods and goddesses became monuments to one-sided divinity. The destruction of Makeda's story was symbolic, the silencing of a world where wisdom had once worn a woman's face. But like all truths buried in sacred soil, the feminine principle never died. It survived in the songs of griots, in the rituals of mothers, in the proverbs whispered by grandmothers who remembered what books forgot. It resurfaced in the resilience of African women who led nations, birthed movements, healed communities, and guarded culture through centuries of darkness. Every act of nurture, resistance, and creation became an echo of Sheba's reign. Today, as scholars and spiritual seekers reconnect with African wisdom traditions, they find her there, not as a relic, but as a guide. She stands beside Mot, beside Oshun, beside Isis, as a symbol of balance restored. She reminds us that the future of humanity depends not on domination, but on cooperation, not on hierarchy, but on harmony. In her name, the ancient principle of unity returns. Ubuntu, I am because we are. Makeda's story is not about gender alone, it is about wholeness. She represents the reunion of the fragmented self, the healing of the split between intellect and emotion, science and spirit, man and woman, Africa and its memory. When her story rises, it brings with it the medicine of remembrance. And that is her truest divinity, not that she ruled, but that she reconciled, not that she conquered, but that she completed. In her we see the divine feminine, not as myth, but as history's hidden heartbeat, the rhythm that kept Africa alive when the world forgot its music. As the global consciousness begins to awaken to what was lost, Sheba's spirit rises again, not in temples of stone, but in the hearts of those reclaiming balance. The modern woman who leads with compassion, the man who honors emotion as strength, the nation that rebuilds through cooperation, all are children of her wisdom. The Queen of Sheba is no longer a chapter in Scripture. She is the Scripture itself, written in the language of balance, truth, and power. For centuries, historians said there was no proof, no ruins, no inscriptions, no trace of a queen named Makeda who ruled both sides of the Red Sea. They said Sheba was a myth, a poetic flourish in Scripture, but the ground itself has begun to speak, and the earth does not lie. From Yemen to Ethiopia, from the Horn of Africa to the Arabian Peninsula, the clues to her existence lie half buried in dust and silence, waiting for those who know how to listen. In the arid valley of Merib, the ancient capital of the Sabaean kingdom, archaeologists have uncovered vast temple complexes dedicated to the moon god, Almaka, the same deity Makeda's ancestors are said to have worshipped. The great temple, called the Maram Bilqis, still stands, its towering pillars rising out of the desert like the ribs of a sleeping god. Each column bears inscriptions written in Sabaean, a language older than Hebrew, older than Arabic, the language of Sheba's people. These inscriptions tell of kings and queens who ruled by divine favor, who traded incense and gold across seas. They speak of alliances, of wars, of the dam that tamed the flood. They are not myths, they are records. On the other side of the Red Sea, in northern Ethiopia, the ruins of Yeha tell the same story. A temple built of perfectly cut sandstone blocks stands there, its design identical to the temples in Merib. Its inscriptions, too, are written in Sabaean. The carbon dating places it around the first millennium BCE, precisely the era of the Queen of Sheba. This is not coincidence, this is continuity. The people of Yeha were Sheba's kin, Africans who built in the same style, worshipped the same gods, and traded the same goods. The Red Sea was not a border, it was a bridge, a liquid road connecting two halves of one civilization. Further south, in Axum, the obelisks rise like frozen lightning against the highland sky. Each one is a proclamation of permanence, an architectural language that says, "We were here." The Axumites claimed descent from Sheba's son, Menelik I, and their art bears the proof. Motifs of crescents and suns, the very symbols that adorned the temples of Merib. Coins minted by Axumite kings bore inscriptions, in both Greek and Jeze, declaring their dominion, by the grace of God, son of Solomon, and the Queen of the South. To them, Sheba was not legend, she was lineage. Even the trade routes whisper her name. Ancient records from Egypt and Mesopotamia mention a mysterious land called Saba, or Saba, famed for its gold, frankincense, and myrrh, the gifts of kings. These were not products of Arabia alone. The resin that perfumed temples and palaces came from trees that grew along the Somali coast, in the ancient land of Punt, the same land that Egyptian scribes called God's country. It was Africa that supplied the sacred fragrance of the ancient world. It was Sheba's fleets that carried it. When researchers analyzed the DNA of ancient skeletons found in Ethiopia's highlands, they discovered something remarkable, a blend of African and Arabian lineages, dating back around 3,000 years, the exact period of Sheba's reign. The genes of the Sabians and the peoples of the Horn of Africa had intertwined, just as the Kebra Negus claimed. What theologians once mocked as fable now found confirmation in bone and blood. The story of Makeda and Solomon was more than spiritual metaphor. It was history written in genetics. Even the Bible itself carries clues that modern eyes can now interpret differently. When Solomon greets the Queen of Sheba, the Hebrew text refers to her as Malkat Saba, Queen of the South. The word Saba does not mean Arabia. It means the land of the incense root, a territory stretching across the Red Sea, embracing both sides. To the ancients, Sheba was not a place on a map. It was a civilization that transcended geography. Later interpreters, bound by their own biases, anchored her story to one shore. But the old texts tell us otherwise. She was queen of a world between worlds, African in heart, global in reach. Artifacts, too, are beginning to reclaim her truth. In 2016, a team of Ethiopian and German archaeologists discovered fragments of monumental inscriptions near Axum, referencing a queen whose title translated to Mistress of the Sun. In nearby villages, oral histories spoke of a Makeda who ruled before the ark came. The names had changed through time, but the memory had not. Every discovery adds weight to the revelation that the Queen of Sheba was not a fable, but a historical force, one whose memory was deliberately fractured to fit the mold of empire. The evidence was never missing. It was ignored, misclassified, renamed. Each ruin, each scroll, each oral tradition is a thread that, when woven together, restores the tapestry of her reality. But perhaps the most undeniable proof lies not in stone or scripture, but in continuity, in the unbroken lineage of belief that still beats in the hearts of Ethiopians, Eritreans, Yemenis, Somalis, and the African diaspora. For 3,000 years, they have spoken her name. No myth survives that long without roots. The earth remembers her footsteps. The rivers remember her ships. The stars remember her alignment. And slowly, the world is beginning to remember too. Makeda's resurrection in our consciousness is not an accident. History has a rhythm, and truth returns when the world is ready to listen. Her story is rising now, because the silence that buried her has cracked. Across Africa and the diaspora, the children of those once erased are remembering. They are digging through the dust, not just for ruins, but for roots. The Queen of Sheba's name is re-emerging in classrooms, in music, in politics, in the voices of women who no longer ask for permission to lead. This is not nostalgia, this is reclamation, the reawakening of Africa's first global power and the feminine force it represented. In an age obsessed with empire, Makeda ruled through wisdom. In a world that worshipped violence, she mastered trade. While other monarchs built walls, she built bridges across seas, across faiths, across bloodlines. Her return in our time is a reminder that leadership was not always synonymous with conquest, that intelligence could rule as powerfully as the sword. Sheba's empire flourished, not because it conquered its neighbors, but because it understood exchange, the flow of goods, ideas, and respect. It was an early model of globalization, led by African diplomacy, not European expansion. For centuries, Western historians told us civilization flowed outward from Greece and Rome, as if enlightenment had a single source. But the truth is, by the time Europe was learning to read its first alphabets, Africa had already mapped the stars, built the temples, and mastered the trade routes. Sheba was part of that network, an empire that connected Africa to Arabia, India, and beyond. When you look at the trade maps of antiquity, the pattern becomes clear. Sheba was not on the margins of civilization, it was its beating heart. To reclaim her is to reclaim the idea that Africa was never peripheral. The suppression of Sheba's story served a purpose: to keep the narrative of human progress Eurocentric, patriarchal, and whitewashed. Because if Sheba ruled the ancient world's economy, then the world must admit that black power, black intellect, and black sovereignty once stood at the center of civilization. That truth, for centuries, was too dangerous to teach, so they reduced her to poetry, to legend, to something safe, a story to inspire but not to threaten. But legends only fade when their purpose is forgotten, and today, her purpose has returned. The Queen of Sheba's memory calls us to restore the balance between truth and narrative, between feminine and masculine, between Africa and the world. She represents what happens when the forgotten reclaim their history, the moment when identity becomes power. For black women especially, Makeda's image carries sacred defiance. In her reflection, they see what the world once feared: that strength and grace can coexist, that beauty can wield wisdom, that black womanhood has always been divine. She was not a queen because Solomon loved her. Solomon loved her because she was a queen. And through that love, she transformed history, not by bending to it, but by rewriting it. In Ethiopia, her name still opens prayers. In Eritrea, her lineage still crowns legends. In the diaspora, her image still fuels movements that demand dignity and self-determination. Sheba's power has transcended empire. It has become symbol, a reminder that truth, like light, cannot be permanently buried. Makeda's story also speaks to the modern struggle for cultural sovereignty. Africa's resources are still coveted, its narratives still distorted. The battle has changed form, but not purpose. Sheba's descendants now fight not with armies, but with education, art, and truth. The same tools she used to shape her world. Every documentary, every rediscovered manuscript, every repatriated artifact is an act of resurrection. Each time her name is spoken, the lie loses power. The real Queen of Sheba is not just history, she is prophecy fulfilled. Her rise in this century is a signal that the time of hidden greatness is ending, that Africa's contributions can no longer be whispered or ignored. She represents the return of a memory that colonization could not kill, a light that slavery could not extinguish. Her power was never about domination. It was about divine alignment, leading through understanding, ruling through connection, and embodying balance. These are the lessons humanity needs now, in a world tearing itself apart with greed and division. Sheba reminds us that civilization does not begin with conquest, but with wisdom. She is the mirror of what we lost, and the map of what we can still become. The Queen of Sheba's legacy is not a call to nostalgia, but a call to transformation. She invites the world to return to the principle Africa once lived by. We lead when we remember who we are. And as the dust clears and her image emerges again, regal, dark-skinned, crowned by the sun, one truth becomes impossible to deny. They did not erase her, they only delayed her return. In the highlands of Ethiopia, where the air is thin and the mountains cradle the sky, Makeda's story took root and became blood. Her journey to Jerusalem was not an ending, but a beginning, the birth of a lineage that would define African sovereignty for nearly 3,000 years. The Kebra Nagast, Ethiopia's sacred national epic, tells us that when the Queen of Sheba returned from her meeting with King Solomon, she carried within her not just gifts, but prophecy. She bore a son, Menelik, destined to unite two worlds, Israel and Africa. According to the text, when Menelik came of age, he traveled to meet his father. Solomon, recognizing the divine spark of his mother in the boy, offered him the throne of Israel. But Menelik refused. He chose to return to his mother's land, to Africa. carrying with him the wisdom and relics of his father's faith. The story says he did not return empty-handed. Accompanied by the sons of Israel's nobles, Menelik brought the Ark of the Covenant itself, the sacred chest said to contain the stone tablets of God's law. The Ark, the symbol of divine presence, found its new home, not in Jerusalem, but in Axum, the capital of Ethiopia. To the Western world, this claim sounded impossible, almost blasphemous, but to Ethiopians, it is the cornerstone of identity. The moment when divine authority crossed from East to Africa. The Church of St. Mary of Zion, in Axum, still guards what it claims is the original Ark, watched over by a single guardian monk who will never leave its side. He does not speak to the public, does not take disciples, and dies in the service of protecting what his ancestors brought. His life is a living testament to the unbroken thread of Sheba's lineage. Whether literal or symbolic, the Ark represents something undeniable, that divine history, once written in the sands of Israel, found permanence in the mountains of Africa. This bloodline, the Solomonic dynasty, became the foundation of Ethiopia's monarchy, a line that endured until 1974, when Emperor Haile Selassie, the 225th ruler, said to descend from Menelik I, was dethroned. For nearly 3 millennia, the kings and queens of Ethiopia traced their right to rule back to Makeda, the Queen of Sheba. No other African monarchy held such a continuous claim, unbroken by colonization or foreign conquest. Ethiopia remained the only African nation never fully colonized, its independence itself a whisper of Sheba's enduring protection. Haile Selassie, known to the world as Ras Tafari before his coronation, understood this divine inheritance. He spoke of Africa's redemption long before independence movements swept the continent. His speeches echoed Makeda's wisdom that leadership must be guided by spiritual purpose, not greed. When Jamaica's Rastafarian movement declared him the living embodiment of God, it was not coincidence. They were invoking the ancient covenant of Sheba's bloodline, the sacred bridge between heaven and Africa. The Rastafarians did not invent that divinity, they rediscovered it. Makeda's lineage carried more than royal authority, it carried resistance. When Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935, Haile Selassie's defiance became global legend. He stood before the League of Nations and warned, "It is us today, it will be you tomorrow." His courage was the echo of Makeda's spirit, a queen's legacy reborn in a modern emperor. When Ethiopia emerged victorious, the world saw more than a political victory. It saw Africa's ancient light refusing to be extinguished. But the Solomonic bloodline was more than political. It symbolized Africa's right to define its own holiness. In a world where blackness had been branded as sin, Ethiopia stood as proof that blackness could be divine, not in borrowed theology, but in original truth. The story of Sheba and Solomon was the reclamation of sacred narrative, the idea that God had not forgotten Africa, and Africa had never forgotten God. Even today, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, with its ancient chants and rituals, continues traditions that predate European Christianity. Its liturgy is sung in Jez, the same script that once inscribed the walls of Sheba's temples. Its priests wear crowns that echo Makeda's own regality. Every ceremony, every hymn, is a living continuation of that covenant, forged between queen and king, between earth and divinity. And yet, beyond theology and dynasty, Sheba's legacy endures as a cultural heartbeat. In music, she is sung as the mother of Ethiopia. In art, she is painted as the Black Madonna, before Europe ever dreamed of one. In the diaspora, she is invoked as the archetype of black sovereignty, of ancient power unbroken by time. Her story gave birth to empires, inspired movements, and redefined what it means to be chosen. Makeda's bloodline proved that the African throne was not a myth. It was a mirror of God's order, a testament that civilization did not need the West to bless it, for it had been blessed since Sheba herself walked the earth. When the world forgot, Ethiopia remembered. When history erased, the highlands preserved. And through that unbroken chain of remembrance, the Queen of Sheba's spirit lives, not as memory, but as inheritance. Her lineage teaches one final truth: divine power does not fade when buried. It sleeps, waiting for the moment when its descendants rise to claim it. And that moment, as the world rediscovers Africa's hidden past, is now. They tried to make her a myth, but the truth refused to die. The Queen of Sheba, Makeda, is not just a story of the past. She is a mirror of what the future demands. Her legacy calls across millennia, not as nostalgia, but as prophecy. She stands as a warning to those who build power on lies, and as a beacon to those who rebuild truth from ashes. Her name is rising again, because the world is beginning to remember that Africa was never the dark continent. It was the first light. Her relevance today is not confined to the pages of history or the halls of theology. It breathes in the movements of decolonization, in the rediscovery of Black spirituality, in the reawakening of women who remember their ancient crowns. Makeda's story is the bridge between past and possibility, proof that greatness is not granted, but remembered. Every suppressed history, every hidden artifact, every silenced voice finds its reflection in her. For she too was erased, rebranded, reduced, and yet she rises, again and again, because truth cannot be colonized. Look around the world today, from the universities reevaluating Africa's role in human civilization, to the artists painting Black royalty with divine light, to the scholars uncovering Sheba's ruins and rewriting her empire's history. The spirit of Makeda is moving again. It moves through the diaspora, through the drums of resistance, through the poetry of pride. It moves through the young girl in Lagos, learning about Kush and Kemet instead of kings and queens of Europe. It moves through the boy in Harlem, realizing that the Bible's most mysterious queen was Black, powerful, and African like him. That awakening is revolution. The Queen of Sheba matters today because she redefines the concept of power. In a world still obsessed with domination, she reminds us that true sovereignty lies in wisdom, in balance, in remembering who we are. Her reign was not built on war but on exchange, not on fear, but on respect. She proved that influence comes not from erasing others, but from uplifting all who cross your path. That is the African way, the way of Makeda, of harmony, of divine reciprocity. It is the way the world must return to if it is ever to heal. Makeda also stands as the archetype of the Black woman's resilience. She embodies the power to lead without apology, to command without cruelty, to nurture without submission. She is every ancestor who built kingdoms from nothing, every mother who kept history alive through song and story. To remember her is to remember that the Black woman was not made to follow history, she was made to make it. Her story dismantles the colonial narrative that civilization trickled southward from Europe and the Middle East. It shows that wisdom and faith flowed out of Africa, not into it. That the roots of human spirituality, trade, and governance were born beneath Black skin, under African suns. Sheba's name is proof that Africa was global long before globalization, spiritual long before religion, powerful long before empire. Today, as we face a world choking on disconnection and greed, Sheba's lessons are urgent. She teaches us that the purpose of knowledge is not domination, but elevation, that leadership is sacred only when it serves balance, that the future belongs to those who remember the ancient rhythm, that harmony is strength, and truth is freedom. Her return is not symbolic, it is the rebirth of perspective. To speak her name now is to summon the memory of the world's first global queen, a woman who commanded nations, redefined diplomacy, and proved that Africa was never behind. She is the counterspell to colonial amnesia, the antidote to historical blindness. And as her story resurfaces, so too does the collective memory of every African empire that once stood proud before the world. Makeda's resurrection in our time is no accident. It is alignment. It is history correcting itself. It is the ancestors whispering, "Remember who you are. because remembering her is remembering ourselves, the builders, the thinkers, the originators. She was the mother of empires, the keeper of balance, the queen who made kings kneel not through war, but through wisdom. And though her throne may be buried under sand, her spirit sits enthroned in every heart that dares to reclaim the truth. They turned her into a myth to make you forget your beginning, but you can hear her now, can't you? Beneath the noise, beneath the centuries of silence, her voice clear and commanding, rising again. Africa was the first, Africa was the light. And when the final words fade, when the music settles into silence, her message remains, timeless, defiant, and eternal. They tried to bury the truth, but we are the descendants of those who remember.